Thank you for that introduction, Martha. So I am a historian of what I would call the parade of scientific thought styles that have repeatedly defined and redefined addiction, primarily in the US experience. So I study people who study people who do, mainly the opioids, although, of course, over my career, I've sometimes wandered into other domains as well. So the brains and minds and bodies of people whose lives become entangled with the opioids, and I will call them addicts in this lecture today, because primarily the people who were studying them, sometimes they have tried very hard, some of them in this room, to change the language and the stigma. Since the 1920s, you'll learn, we have been trying to destigmatize addiction. It is a word that came with a fair amount of baggage, but we didn't use it in this country until the very late 19th century, despite the fact that we had morphine and we used it widely. In fact, in the 19th century, 2/3 of the addicts in this country were people who looked pretty much like me. They were upper and middle class white women, maintained on morphine by their physicians. Physicians were the only ones who had syringes, and so they were pretty much had a monopoly on the intravenous market. So what I'd like to start off talking about today is, obviously, we know the end of the story, right? We know that addiction was redefined as a chronic relapsing brain disease or disorder in the 1990s. And I am going to tell you that story. But I'm also going to take you on a trip back in time to many different moments when there were different constructions of addiction that really contested with one another. And so I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in the 1950s because that was an interesting time for our era. So is the mic working? There seems to me to be a little feedback or echo. Is that really okay with you? All right. It's fine. Okay. All right. So during this era, the 1950s, it was the first mandatory minimum sentences for any crime. First went into effect in 1951. That was an important year. And they went into effect essentially for violations of the Harrison Act of 1914 and the Heroin Act of 1924. So addiction in this era is most assuredly constructed as a crime. Public health researchers begin, and an occasional sociologist, I might add, to protest that construction by defining addiction as a chronic relapsing disease. So the definition of addiction as a chronic relapsing disease dates from the 1950s, and it issues from a place that I'm going to talk a lot about today because I always do. For me, it always goes back to the US narcotic farm, and so I will introduce you to that place. I have made a career of saying that place matters, that the thinking that people do and the processing that they do, the redefining and the conceptualization of science, it matters where they are and who they are and how they are interacting with one another. In other words, the social conditions and relations of science matter for the kind of science that is done. And in particular, a science that is from the beginning a human subject science requires a lot of interaction between the addict and the addiction researcher. Because who knows the most about addiction when we know nothing, right? Or when we know little? It is often the person who uses these substances, and they were often quite articulate. So, chronic relapsing disease. Thinking about how disease constructs change over time, we have to ask what cultural work disease constructs accomplish. The clinical cast of the phrase chronic relapsing disorder contrasted to the definition of addiction as a crime, vice, or moral or character flaw, which had adhered to addiction from the late 19th, early 20th century. The term addiction was burdened by moral baggage, and scientists themselves refrained from using it. And they sought less stigmatized ways to talk about it. Writing just 1 year Before the World Health Organization adopted the term drug dependence, they didn't want to use the term addiction, Jerry Jaffe emphasized that addiction applied only to extreme cases for his entry in the 1965 third edition of Goodman and Gilman's Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics, which was a major desk reference. So reflecting on why he opposed defining addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease in the 1990s, Jaffe, in an interview with me, said these things. I have fought that kind of construction. And he goes on to note that there might well be long-lasting effects and difficulty stopping, but nevertheless, he objected to the brain disease construct, reasoning that in an environment where you don't start again, it's a disorder that has no known disabilities. It's a funny kind of brain disease that doesn't impair you in any way, except when you start using drugs. The idea that it's a brain disease means, and one could contest this, of course, that if you could just fix that part of the brain, there'd be no problem. But that is not where the major inaccuracy resides. It resides in defining the entire continuum by samples taken from the extreme, those who seek treatment. As Lee Robbins' Vietnam study showed, and don't forget that Jaffe was in a position to fund and make sure that Lee Robbins' Vietnam study happened, even heroin dependence is not always a chronic relapsing disorder if you look at it in the general population. So historically, projects to redefine addiction make assumptions about who should treat it, what kinds of political and cultural authority are involved in treating it and should be invoked to respond to it. So back now to the 1950s. That was sort of my preamble in the present. In the 1950s, a joint committee of the American Bar Association and the American Medical Association embarked upon a project to redefine addiction. Drug addiction, what is it? Crime or disease? And in the end, they decided it was a disease. But then you have to ask the question, what kind of disease, right? Because when you think about it, there are many kinds of disease. Possibilities abound. In Alcoholics Anonymous, 12-step or therapeutic communities, concepts of addiction call it an allergy. Metabolic disease is preferred by those who prescribe methadone maintenance treatment in response. Currently prevailing notions of addiction as a complex brain disorder position addiction neuroscience as a basic translational hope, a hope that basic research will translate into clinical approaches. So notice the pattern, right? Your preferred treatment modality entails your definition of what is being treated, who is being treated, and the modality that is best suited for the job. So the disease concept has long been offered as part of the principled scientific and medical response to addiction as a crime. Narcotic addiction has bedeviled the United States for a very, very long time. The opium problem came out in 1928. It was the Rockefeller Bureau of Social Hygiene in New York City. It summarized 4,000 studies that had occurred on the topic of addiction up to 1928. Yeah, they did that book without a computer. They summarized 4,000 studies without a search engine. It's an amazing thing to us, right? Addiction, however, in that book, is very much defined in many places as a neurological condition. Death in morphine poisoning is brain death, right? There is very much a knowledge already, right, that the central nervous system is involved. These, by the way, I'm going to show you two of them. They're translations from the German that appeared in Terry and Pelham's book, The Opium Problem. And so it was defined as the opium problem. It was the opium problem, it was the morphine problem. In 1928, it wasn't yet, quite yet, the heroin problem, although Terry and Pelham's did note that some people used heroin for purposes of dissolution. And so there was beginning to be an association of heroin with urban vice districts and populations who inhabited urban vice districts. So morphine, okay. By the 1920s, addiction is considered a nervous condition. Morphine, derived from opium poppies, joined cocaine and arsenic which you might recall was habitually eaten. Was that an addiction? And plants like wild rue, which worked effects on the central nervous systems of humans and animals. So these quotes, right, they illustrate morphine was quite commonly used. It was, as most people know, widely available before, during, and after the 1914 Harrison Act, which criminalized it. It criminalized, so although its main vector was physicians, for only they possessed needles and syringes right up through the Second World War. That is something that many people don't realize. These are syringes that were confiscated during admission to the narcotic farm. And if you notice, some of them look like ballpoint pens. Some of them are highly personalized, right? Some people could afford a syringe and did obtain syringes and use them. However, it wasn't common. Doctors shifted the white upper and middle class women I was talking about before onto barbiturates and other substances. However, many doctors, as you will hear from David Hertzberg later today, maintained their patients quietly on morphine. They understood that the sick and the elderly needed access to this medication. Also, something many people don't know is that short-lived morphine maintenance clinics sprouted up in 40 U.S. cities in the late teens, all shut down by the Heroin Act of 1924. By that time, all the morphine maintenance clinics were shut down, typically by the IRS. They were typically shut down for administrative and tax infractions. So heroin was becoming more popular and more widely used at that point. The practice of morphine maintenance also came to the attention of the Supreme Court in 1919, when the court affirmed that the constitutionality of the Harrison Act and clarified that physicians could be prosecuted for writing prescriptions to keep patients comfortable by maintaining their customary use. That is written into the opinion. So it is the practice of maintenance and the policy of maintenance that becomes a prosecutable offense. So changes in medical practice and intensifying heroin use meant that by the end of the 1920s, more than 1/3 of federal prisoners who were at that point crowded into U.S. prisons were there as Harrison Act violators. In 1929, early 1929, a key date, Congress embarked on a grand experiment that they called the narcotic farm. Sold to the public as a new deal for the drug addict, the premise was that addicts could not only be cured, but rehabilitated through fresh air and hard work, vocational training, and science. Congress expressed great faith that science would find a cure for opiate addiction and solve the opium problem by finding a substitute, this is important, for morphine, a substitute, and getting morphine out of international commerce. If you didn't need morphine, you didn't need opium poppies, and you didn't have heroin. Mandated to search for a cure, the laboratory that Congress mandated in the first U.S. narcotic farm in Lexington, Kentucky in 1935 has been central to the U.S. approach ever since. The narcotic farm was built, and it's important to understand this because it doesn't look like that to us. It was built as an alternative to prison. It may look like a prison to you, but it was built as an alternative to prison. The idea was diversion, right? Let's get these heroin addicts out of the prison population. The laboratory was a very small part. This is a 1,500-bed institution. The laboratory was never larger than 40 to 60 beds, and at most points, particularly in the beginning, all of the studies that were done at Lexington were done on 6 subjects at a time. So the narcotic farm basically functioned like a drug court. Judges could mandate someone go to the narcotic farm, and 2/3 of the people who lived at the narcotic farm at any given time were felons. They were mandated there. They were serving sentences, but the other third were volunteers. They could show up at the gates of the narcotic farm and say, I'm a narcotic addict, I have paperwork from my doctor, I need a cure. And they could stay for 6 months. It was a 6-month cure. a 6-month cure. So, the laboratory is what I want to talk a bit about. Used experimental subjects, so-called post-addicts. So when they published the many scientific studies, they referred to their subjects as post-addicts. They were recruited into what were essentially small-scale trials, clinical trials. Remember this is the 1930s, okay? Research director Clifton Himmelsbach, some of you might recognize his name, evolved an indigenous concept of informed consent called dealing the patient in, surely an allusion to the many card games that occurred in the common rooms of the narcotic farm. Known as the Addiction Research Center after 1948, the lab became the world's premier scientific outpost for studying addiction, and for decades it was really the only one. It was the clinical research node, however, of a larger effort that I wanted to point to. This committee responded to our drugged nation, as it was called in the 1920s. In other words, what we are living through now, right, a national level opioid epidemic, is something we have always been the world's most voracious consumers of the opioids. And what they were trying to do here is reduce indications for opiates to an irreducible minimum. They wanted morphine and other opiates to only be used in strict cases of medical necessity. So morphine was the target, and the way that they were going to make their way towards it was basically to dissect the morphine molecule, right? They had a chemical bench that they coordinated, a medicinal chemistry bench at NIH. They had an animal pharmacology laboratory at the University of Michigan, which was basically a morphine-dependent colony of rhesus macaques. And they had the clinical research node at the narcotic farm, which law enforcement, it was kind of a marriage made in heaven, law enforcement constantly delivers to them good subjects, seasoned, experienced narcotic addicts, who can tell them a lot about the drugs that they are testing. And so you gradually see the federal government becoming more and more invested in the coordination of these research projects, because the Bureau of Social Hygiene in New York City thought that this turned out to be a bigger project than they really intended to fund. And so you see that movement to the National Research Council and to the Division of Medical Sciences, where it remained until 1977. So from 1939 to 1977, this committee, or it was sometimes named differently, especially after the World Health Organization adopts the term drug dependence, it changes to being the Committee on Problems of Drug Dependence, and CPDD. Some of you may know CPDD still exists in existence, but in a radically different form. So setting up a machinery for a specific purpose, like finding a non-addicting analgesic, was actually new for the NRC and the multi-sited organization of science. Now, many people think about the social organization of this kind of science as occurring during World War II with the malaria project, with malaria prophylaxis. Actually, the addiction research predated, and in fact, several of the pharmacologists who were involved in this effort were pulled off this effort and put onto the malaria project. And so this effort was actually presaging what we would call big science, the federal investment in science. And I think that's an important thing, because although I, as a historian, can't really claim to be, stigmatized, I suppose, it is interesting to me that historians of science have not seen this project as the kind of coordinated federal assault upon a social problem that it was. And so I think that's a very interesting thing, because addiction researchers will always claim they are studying a stigmatized disease, and in fact, sometimes that happens without so much scientific recognition and honor. So centrally organized and orchestrated, this research program was really one of the first scientific collaborations across laboratories and across levels and types of science. Housing a technologically advanced psychopharmacology lab in a 1,500-bed prison hospital in the middle of Kentucky. Himmelsbach and Eddy, Nathan B. Eddy, was became the chair of this committee, and this is Clifton Himmelsbach, pioneered what they called a morphine substitution technique that was based on the principle that a substance which will support and maintain the addicted state is essentially addictive in and of itself. They sought to understand the relationship of chemical structure to, quote, addictiveness, and they created a point score system to track the morphine abstinence syndrome. Based on close observation of 65 of their subjects, passing through cycles of tolerance, addiction, and withdrawal. Yes, they put subjects into withdrawal. They re-addicted people who were no longer dependent on morphine or heroin because they were institutionalized. Calculating the intensity of abstinence symptoms and predicting their course, they quantified standards by which you could take any drug and determine whether it had addiction potential or abuse liability, as we later came to call it. Studies involved exactly that, getting subjects re-addicted, maintaining them, putting them into withdrawal, giving them another compound to see if that substance then arrested abstinence symptoms. Such studies evolved as predictive techniques, but the overarching question of them, the research question behind it all, is what is the difference between addicts and non-addicts, and why is it that some people similarly exposed to an opioid become drug-seeking and compulsive users and others do not? So the intense individual variation was always a puzzle for this science. And I think that those of you who are here who are addiction researchers would agree that it still is, right? There is still that kind of question. So for the sake of clarity and brevity, I'm going to just put these up rather than talk about them, because I want to tell you about an early finding that was a milestone for making addiction a brain disease later on, by the end of the 20th century. So biophysicist Howard Andrews built the first EEG machine west of the Allegheny Mountains at Lexington. He wanted to know what was going on in the brains of these addicts, and that's how he talked about it later. He regarded his work, however, as unsuccessful. He left Kentucky when the Second World War began. Most of this group left Kentucky when the war began. Bob Felix, in particular, is important because he becomes the founding director of NIMH in 1948. So when poor Howard Andrews left Kentucky, he left with a sense of personal failure. And he later remarked, "It now seems clear that the recognizable information content of an EEG is considerably less than the earlier enthusiasts had hoped." But he demonstrated something really interesting, and that was that chronic morphine administration led to changes in the brain that persisted more than a year after withdrawal. And the technologies, of course, employed were really incapable of more robust measures of what was actually going on in the brains of these addicts. There was no real consensus about what that finding meant. So you have to imagine yourself a scientist in this situation and trying to understand how would you create and systematize a science? How would you do that in a humane and compassionate way? These were scientists who felt that their subjects were highly intelligent. They felt that they were not that much different than they are. They really felt that there was something neurophysiological going on, and that that's what they were trying to get at. Relapse, of course, was a huge problem at the narcotic farm. There were people, they were called winders. They would wind in, and they would wind out, and they would wind in. And they would do that. One guy did it 43 times across the 40 years that the narcotic farms were in business and treated hundreds of thousands of people. And so you had people who relapsed and came back. Why did they come back? Well, there was good food. There was good jazz. There was also dental care. And healthcare. Physicians, back to the Harrison Act, would not treat addicts, and dentists would not treat addicts, and that was because they did not want to be prosecuted. They were avoiding prosecution, and they were avoiding learning very much about opioids in medical school. There was systematic ignorance put into place in medical schools in this country about addiction. As Dr. O'Brien can surely attest, he's been working on it since the 1970s to try to get medical education to embrace thinking about addiction, and it's been a very difficult thing to happen until perhaps now. So the second generation, I want to tell you a little bit more about. I won't go into excessive detail here because I know I'm a historian and sometimes I can get into excessive detail. There were some pretty interesting scientists who end up at the narcotic farm. They're U.S. Public Health Service scientists. The narcotic farm has one of the first psychiatry residency programs in the entire country. People are going there both for their national service and also because very few people went there because they were interested in addiction. Most people went there because they didn't want to go to Alaska, or they don't want to work for the Coast Guard, or something along those lines. So one of the people who went there in the 1940s is this young man, Abraham Whipper. And he came to Lexington in 1940 as a psychiatry resident, and he became a theorist who really defined dependence in operationalizable terms and dominated addiction research for quite some time. Now, during the war, during the Second World War, opiates were stockpiled. Not only in Fort Knox, I just learned, but there were opiate stockpiles all over the country in different places. And after the war's end, some of those opiates begin to make their way out into the street. Also, after the war's end, needles and syringes become much more available than they had been before the war. The racial ethnic composition of the modal Lexington patient began to change. The modal Lexington patient before the war is a white male, age 45 or older, typically called a drifter. And you see, the racing form or whatever, he's far more interested in that than he is in the pretty young nurse, right? So that is a stereotypical kind of picture of what, these patients looked like. He's receiving a manicure. This is clearly a staged photo. After the war, you can see the date, it's July 1951. You're going to see many more African American and Puerto Rican people of color who are going to the narcotic farm. It's still majority white. It never, the narcotic farm ends in 1975. It's always majority white. However, you do see a demographic shift across the 1950s. You also see those mandatory minimums I told you about in the early 1950s are increased across that decade. And so, by the 1950s, right, Congress is frustrated about the narcotic problem. They begin to call for deportation of foreign nationals, death to drug dealers. We have had that before. The carceral state is expanding. Science also becomes bound up with drug control. On that committee, the Committee on Drug Addiction and Narcotics, sits the Federal Bureau of Narcotics Chief Harry Anslinger. Where did Lexington get the drugs? Where did they get their research materials? They got them from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. They would seize the drugs and they would clean them at NIH, they would recrystallize them, they would purify them, and they would standardize them. Not only did this save the scientists money, it also bound them in interesting ways to drug control and also to the pharmaceutical industry. Because what's really happening at Lexington is that any pharmaceutical company that wants to put an analgesic on the market they have to make the claim it's less addictive or it's better in some way, right? And so all of the testing of those claims was done at Lexington. This was really one of the only captive populations of human subjects who knew something, and researchers who knew something about how can you tell if an analgesic is addictive or not, if you want to put it on the market. And so they were essentially together making what we would call today scheduling decisions, right? In 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was went into effect. And so the international treaties that govern psychoactive commerce are very much owe a lot to the data, the human data that is being produced at Lexington, at the Addiction Research Center, and also at NIH. This is the analgesics section at NIH. You'll see Everett May, for those of you, some of you might know remember some of these people, and Nathan Eddy there in the middle. Joe Cochin is there. There's some other people you would know as well. So they were well represented on all the expert committees that made the decisions about global drug control, the League of Nations, the UN, the World Health Organization. In the 1950s, the other interesting thing that's going on that's important to consider today is that this is Harris Isbell. He's the research director by now. He replaced Clifton Himmelsbach. And he's sitting at a cabinet full of barbitals, barbiturates, right? Phenobarbital, secobarbital, all of those. Medicalization and criminalization, in other words, are going hand in hand. The legal market, as well as the illegal market, law enforcement, and scientific researchers. And law enforcement held very neurological beliefs at the time. This is Harry Anslinger talking about the drug having a corroding effect on the body and the mind, weakening the entire physical system and often leading to insanity after prolonged use, right? So it's a kind of neural psychopathology. Now, the end of the First World War brought methadone to the Addiction Research Center, and also in 1948, the laboratory, despite the fact that these scientists did not like the term addiction, and they preferred to use the term drug dependence, they still named it the Addiction Research Center, and it was one of only 2 working laboratories associated with NIMH at the end of, when it came into being, at the end of World War II. So, methadone was an interesting drug, right, for them. And what you should also understand is that typically, if an addicted person is arrested in New York City, they're lucky because there are a couple of hospital-based treatment programs in New York City, or they can just be sent to Lexington. But if you were arrested anywhere else in the country, you kicked your habit cold turkey in a jail without any medical assistance whatsoever. And so one other reason that people went to the narcotic farm, particularly after 1948, is that they had a methadone detox. They had a 10-day, 2-week taper. It was a methadone detoxification process, and they went through detox there. Now, methadone was not used for maintenance at the narcotic farm, and the reason was because the researchers there did studies. They had a liking scale. If post-addicts liked a drug, liked it too much, right? They are quantifying subjective effects. That is the business that they're in. If they liked it too much, right, it needed to be controlled because people it would create an addiction problem outside the institution. So it was not until the 1960s that you see Vince Dole and Marie Neiswander in New York City at Rockefeller Institute developing experimental protocols for maintaining people on methadone. So methadone maintenance was opposed at the narcotic farm because everybody said, it's just another agonist. It's the same thing as heroin and morphine. Why are we talking about giving it out to more people or maintaining people on it? So they opposed methadone maintenance. For all their insistence that addiction was a chronic relapsing disease, they did not see a chronic administration of a medication as a solution. The idea of meeting chronicity with chronicity was directly opposed. And that was because of that alliance with drug control, right? The US has been anti-maintenance, and that anti-maintenance consensus was maintained right through this period. Vincent Dole and Marie Neiswander were harassed by the federal, by then it's not the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, it's the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, and it's then later named the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA that we have today, during Nixon's sort of reconsolidation of drug law enforcement. So, back to Wickler, because one of the things that the points that I really want to leave you with about place matters, Wickler would listen closely to his subjects. And one of the actual, and I know that it's difficult for people to believe that a historian would advocate for human subjects research of this kind and say that within the ethics of its day, it was ethical, that people knew what they were getting into, and that there was a fairly high level of knowledge about the drugs that they were receiving and the experimental conditions. Wickler would listen to his subjects, and they would describe to him their feelings when they were leaving the narcotic farm and going back towards their own neighborhoods on the bus or the train or however it was that they were going home. And they would tell him that they began craving heroin and feeling that they were in withdrawal, even though they had not experienced an opioid drug in months. The ARC had a protocol whereby they could not administer an opioid drug within 6 months of departure. And so he began to think that perhaps conditioning actually arose from social cues. And he became very interested in classical conditioning and whether what he felt was that the social environment contributed to chronic administration. And so most pharmacologists in that era mainly studied acute administration of a substance, not chronic. The only place in the world where chronic administration was chronically studied was in fact the Addiction Research Center. They were very interested in chronicity and relapse and what creates the conditions within which relapse is more likely than not, right? So that was kind of, a motivating question for Wickler. They were quite well aware that their own relapse rates were between 90 and 95%. Now, I don't know what you would say our relapse rates are today in different modalities, but they're pretty much around the same place. In other words, high relapse rates is part of the condition, right? And people began to understand, relapse is part of this condition. It's integral to the condition. It is not an anomaly. So, understanding that neurochemical and physiological changes, as well as social cues, were involved, Wickler thought that addicted persons' bodies and brains fell victim, in fact, to inflexibility, augmentation of a tendency to respond invariably under varying environmental conditions in accordance with those reaction patterns which are most stable for the individual. This was Wickler's, his magnum opus, The Relation of Psychiatry to Pharmacology, 1957. So in other words, they fell back on what had worked in the past. Don't most of us? What was needed, Wickler said, was simultaneous study of brain activity and behavior. And he was not the only person who thought we needed this. C. Marchetti, who was the research director, the first research director of NIMH, who studied cerebral circulation, he had been summoned to Bethesda by Bob Felix to direct the new NIMH Clinical Research Center, which opened in Bethesda in 1951. It is a building even larger than the narcotic farm. And Ketty undertook to direct the greatest program for this is him talking, for the study of brain and behavior that the world had ever seen. His research was cornerstone for the development of neuroimaging technologies, but in his era, the inner workings of the brain could be revealed only through speech, drug response, or nascent methodologies like his developed to study cerebral circulation. So drug probes, right? The reason they're studying all these drugs is not because they're wanting to dose people with novel substances. It is because they want to know something about the inner workings of the brain. But they are limited by the available technologies of that kind. So let's see, I don't have to do that part. Now I'm going to just jump for a second to introduce you to yet another research director at the ARC, Bill Martin, William R. Martin, and Jules Sloan. He's pictured here with Jules Sloan. Martin was a neuropharmacologist who had been trained by Klaus Una at the University of Illinois, and he hypothesized the existence of multiple opiate receptors. He said, there can't just be one opiate receptor, right? We're in the late 60s. He's at the narcotic farm. He's observing. What he's looking for is what he called the magical ratio of narcotic antagonists like cyclazazine, naloxone, or nalorphine. And he's also looking at what partial agonist antagonists, or what we know as buprenorphine. So he's looking for drug profiles that will work as addiction therapeutics. Because in all of this, right, I've told you that first they're looking for a non-addicting analgesic. We still haven't found one. They've picked a really tough nut to crack, right? And then secondly, they're making sure that another heroin doesn't go on the market. And now they're beginning to have yet another motivation, which is, this is a really tough disorder to treat, and we'd like some pharmacological support in, what could we figure out, right? Could you use a narcotic antagonist to deter use, or to interrupt it, or to extinguish it, right? So they begin to think, well, okay, what else, we're not getting anywhere, we're not finding a cure, right? But they begin to realize that the ambition to find a cure is way too much. What we have to do is, let's see if we can find something that will help people who want to stop using opioids. So they expand their equipment, they expand their personnel. This is Chuck Gorodetsky and Song-Ping Su, who comes out of Avram Goldstein's lab, right? There's a search in the, and it really heats up at NIH, but also at Stanford, where Avram Goldstein's lab is, to find the opiate receptors and to visualize them. Yes, Bill Martin predicted them and where they would be, and had really quite a lot, was really able to make quite a few interesting hypotheses on the basis of observation of his subjects. But we begin to get new techniques in pharmacology. This is guinea pig ileum, a typical pharmacological assay. And we're now near the end of the sort of science of the narcotic farm. And Song-Ping Su, in his interview with me, talked about the differences between what he had experienced at Stanford and what he experienced at Lexington, almost in utopian terms. So one of the reasons that I got interested in this as a historian is that everyone I was talking to always talked very glowingly and positively about the research at Lexington, and yet there was also a kind of vague aura of unethicality, right, and concerns about the kind of research that was done at Lexington. So I have always maintained that where science is done matters for what science is done, and also what science is not done, what science is undone. Certain kinds of questions can't come up, are foreclosed by the social organization of science, by particular laboratories, by particular thinkers, thought styles. The material conditions within which science is done really matters. It's consequential. And of course, it's also consequential for public perception. The ARC gets in pretty big trouble. This is Harris Isbell and several of the subjects from his experiments, Eddie Flowers, is pictured there, and in the Kennedy hearings. Because after Tuskegee hits in the summer of 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service comes under considerable scrutiny for unethical behavior across time. And so the ARC begins to unravel. In addition, there's something else, and this is always complicated to explain, so I will try to do it in as compressed a way as I possibly can. I told you about mandatory minimums. I told you that people are going to the narcotic farm for 5, 10, 15 years, right? We have long sentences in place for narcotics violations. And in the 1960s, new groups of users, i.e. college students, begin to experiment and begin to use drugs in wider ways. And so we also realize that this criminalization pattern hasn't been working very well. And so in 1966, Congress passes a law called the Narcotic Addict Rehabilitation Act, or NARA. And what NARA did was if you think about the structure of the narcotic farms, there are 2 of them, one's in Texas, one's in Kentucky. You get all of the addicts in the whole country and you put them in a centralized place where they are treated by people who are knowledgeable about drug addiction. They have access to all kinds of activities, alternate reinforcers in the behavioral language of later, yeah, it's just not working. And so what NARA does is it decentralizes addiction treatment. What that law says, and it's a very expensive law, and it's basically only really in effect for 5 years or so, although it's never actually repealed, is it entitles you as an addicted person to treatment wherever you come from. So your hometown in central Pennsylvania needs to have an addiction treatment provider and aftercare. Because the flaw in the narcotic farm system was that there was never supervised aftercare. And people, the chief medical officers, the scientists, everybody complained about that. From the 1940s on, they said, we need aftercare, we need to put aftercare into place. Never happened. So what NARA did in terms of decentralization was it laid the groundwork for the highly decentralized addiction treatment infrastructure that we have today. And what that meant was federal contractors went out and found, was it the Salvation Army, was it Catholic Charities, was it a therapeutic community, who was it who was going to have addiction treatment in each of these places? Well, sometimes they were people who knew nothing at all about addiction, never met a drug addict in their lives before, and suddenly they have a federal contract to treat them. Methadone maintenance also scales up in that way, right? It's still experimental, but it begins to be done in Detroit, in other places, right, besides New York City. And so what you have is an explosion, in a way, if you think about it, a knowledge explosion. Suddenly a lot of people have to learn something about drug addiction and drug addiction treatment. Lexington has become a liability, right? It is tarred with the brush of unethical research because, ironically, NARA also meant that no one was at the narcotic farm long enough to participate in the research studies. And so the researchers had to go out to Atlanta penitentiary, prisons across the country, and recruit people who were there primarily because they were drug addicts or had committed crimes associated with drug addiction, and entice them to transfer to Lexington solely for the purpose of participating in studies. And what that meant was at this time, all phase 1 and phase 2 trials in the country basically are taking place on state prison grounds. But the only research program using felons, federal prisoners, is Lexington. And so ironically, these scientists are carrying around huge key rings. I mean, they complained about the key rings, right? Because they were so heavy and huge. And they were running a prison. And they didn't want to run a prison. They were scientists. They were neuroscientists. They were neuropharmacologists. They were not people who particularly, many of them were politically opposed to prisons. You know, it was a different world. So, in 1975, the Public Health Service gives the keys back to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and the ARC moves to Baltimore, to the campus of Johns Hopkins University, the medical campus of Johns Hopkins University, where, by the way, Joe Brady is already running a behavioral pharmacology research unit, the BPRU. And so the reason they move there is partly because they have friends there, but also partly because they know they can get a subject population. They will no longer have access to captive subjects. They will have to recruit what they refer to as free-living volunteers. They did not think that was necessarily ethical. They had a really different sense of ethics than we might, partly because they didn't really quite believe that they could go on doing the kinds of chronic administration studies that they were doing in people who could go out and use more opioids at night, right? So there were real concerns, right, around what those studies were going to be. So they switched. They started studying nicotine. They started studying other substances where they didn't get into that same kind of problem. So this is Baltimore. The new NIDA building is behind the old behavioral building. I think it's a really nice way to think about place mattering and also understand that really different thought styles and really different ways of doing science were going on. In 1992, NIDA became part of NIH, and the ARC was renamed the NIDA Intramural Research Program. It's no longer called the Addiction Research Center. By that time, addiction research has run into problems. How am I doing on time?
It is technically 5:28. Well, we started a few minutes late.
We did, okay, all right, so I will take you rapidly through this. So addiction research has run into misfortune by the 1990s. The gradual transition in viewing addiction as a brain disease begins with the discovery, oddly, that IV drug use could transmit HIV. The Office of Technology Assessment repeatedly asserted in a 1990 report on the effectiveness of drug abuse treatment that drug abusers showed patterns of relapse and remissions that resemble other chronic diseases, such as arthritis and chronic depression. OTA framed IV drug use as the fatal link between two epidemics, drug abuse and HIV. And it was an obstacle to basically interrupting HIV. And they were also very concerned that the drug abusing population was very heterogeneous. It was very difficult to identify who was and who wasn't. It was the old problem of addiction research. And they cited lack of knowledge about the natural history of a chronic relapsing condition after 30 years of research. And they suggested that addiction research was pervaded by a lack of rigor, unsophisticated design and analysis, anecdotal, uncontrolled studies, and poor study methods. The National Academy of Science Committee to identify strategies to raise the profile of substance abuse and alcoholism research, and the Institute of Medicine reviewed NIDA's research portfolio and cited NIDA favorably for moving towards a randomized controlled trial model. The consensus amounted to an unspoken mandate. The field should court high-status neuroscientists to study addiction as a brain disease, and so legitimate addiction as a scientifically challenging public health problem. NIDA Director Alan Leshner, recruited by Professor O'Brien, proclaimed that addiction would yield to the same kinds of research onslaughts as diabetes or hypertension. So the chronic disease analogy becomes really important in the 1990s, along with the brain disease construct. That decade of the brain cast neuroscientists as somewhat heroic. Okay, I'll read you the whole quote. This is actually from the 1990s from Bill Moyer's special. on addiction. The decade of the brain cast neuroscientists as heroic archaeologists of the brain, united in a quest to unravel the mysteries of the addicted mind, mounting extraordinary scientific expeditions to explain how some people will sacrifice everything to satisfy their hunger for a chemical fix. That hyperbole came out of the mouths of neuroscientists on this Bill Moyer special. Many of you may have seen it. It was called The Hijacked Brain. And it was to chart how drugs enter pathways of the brain and how they alter the brain. I think you were on that special too, were you not, Anna Rose? And so this is a public persuasion exercise, right? Drugs have permanent and irreversible effects on the brain. This is how the message is delivered in a public format. Mass General neuroscientists use a PET scanner in the film to get a picture of the brains of a cocaine user. And you have a whole lot of sort of neuroscience will save the science of addiction research, right? It will raise the status, it will raise the profile, and there's a fair amount of evidence for this claim, by the way. There are many documents, many reports, right, that repeat this claim. One stake in the late 20th century redefinition of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease was the degree and duration of these differences in brain structure and function, right? So that is one of the things, as Leshner put it on the Moyer special, it's a disease because it's the result of drugs changing the brain in fundamental and long-lasting ways. It's actually a different state. And he then offered a haunting characterization of addicts. Imagine being in a state where the drug has totally taken over their being, and what that means clinically is that they're in a condition where they suffer from compulsive, uncontrollable drug seeking and use. So he is trying to use the chronic relapsing brain disease construct in order to overcome the stigma that is attributed to the chronic use of opioids. The brain disorder construct was supposed to unify the field and banish the stigma kind of once and for all, right? That is why addiction was made a brain disease. It is sort of like in the 1950s, people saying it is a disease and not a crime. It is a chronic disease, a chronic relapsing disease, a chronic relapsing brain disease. Each of those are offered in their historical moments as a way to persuade us, right, that this is something worth taking seriously, that it is worth investing in scientifically, that it is indeed a scientific and not a moral puzzle. It is not about will. It is not about decision-making. The 1997 National Academies of Science report noted a lot of gaps in knowledge of long-term effects. Despite all of the research that I spoke to you about, in many, many ways, this is where we have ended up. And I will end here by showing how addiction has become a chronic relapsing brain disease. We begin to get a whole scientific interdiscipline, addiction neuroscience. And we invest in it heavily. I might argue, even at the expense of other ways of knowing addiction, right? So although we do invest in epidemiology, we probably disinvest in more social ways of knowing. And so when we look at the complexities and we see a quote like this by Bill Dewey, a longtime addiction researcher, highly entangled factors. With genetics, we get new genetics research, we get behavioral, environmental, and developmental factors, and yet some of these are studied more than others. And so we begin to have research priorities, right, that begin to contend. So I will leave you with the thought that constructing addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease has not destigmatized it. It has shifted the way we think about addiction, and we are probably going to see, I mean, one thing historians can predict is that things will change, right? This definition, too, will become more expansive. It will become more capacious. There are very interesting extensions, right, of addictions and of brain disease. We will have a sort of evolutionary narrative. This will be ongoing change. But I will leave you with this because I should ask you for your input and your questions and your recollections about some of the events that I've tried to show over time have positioned addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disorder. Thank you.